Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining today's webinar. My name is Jessica. I'm the relatively newly appointed editor of UKTN, and I'm thrilled to be joining and actually hosting this webinar with some amazing panelists. As we are now started, we're going to do a quick round of introductions to the attendees today who are going to be discussing. And if you have any questions, please do write them in the Q&A chat. I'm going to have access to that, so I'll make sure that your questions do get answered at the end. And even if there's a question that kind of relates to a question we're discussing, I can even ask it on kind of in situ. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go around the panelists and ask for a quick introduction, along with a little bit of a summary as to why they've joined the talk today. Ritan, would you like to start?
Thanks, Jessica. Yep. I'm Ritam. I'm the founder of Studio Graphene. We're a digital product studio, and we design and build custom software for a huge range of clients. And the reason for being on this panel and being excited about this topic is we've built a product called Pulse, which essentially allows us to monitor the quality and velocity of software delivery. And it's a topic we're really passionate about and constantly trying to identify ways to measure quality and velocity. That's why I'm here.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. And Steve?
Hi. So Steve Ross Talbot. I've been in the industry since I did my O-level in computer studies in 1974. It was all punch cards and paper tape back then. And I guess over a long career, I find myself in a position to be able to give back. So I've acquired a lot of knowledge. I've done a lot of things wrong, reflected upon it. So I want to spread the knowledge, part of why I'm here, and learn along the way, because the one thing that I have learned is that I don't know everything, despite what my father says about himself. And I like to measure things. So this particular panel is important because I've always liked to measure, always, since I was a teenager, trying to measure the diameter of the moon with my Meccano set. And measurement is the lifeblood of software development processes, and indeed automation around the world, from the Springfield rifle in the Civil War in America to automation that we see with robots in car manufacturing. And I'm sure there's additional automation that will come as we get to understand more. It's when we understand more, we automate. So the metrics that we can come up with in forums like this, and the tools that we can use to gather that information, give us insight, will become a key driver to the future innovation in our industry. That's why I'm here.
Fantastic. Thanks, Steve. Well said. And Cameron?
Hi, everyone. My name's Cameron. I'm the Chief Product Officer of Premise. We're a post-purchase communications platform, and we're currently going through a real scaling phase now after a successful seed round back in December 2023. So why I'm here is to kind of share my learnings and insights around measurable outcomes and how we've applied those measurements in our business, what we've learned, what's worked, what hasn't, and yeah, excited to be here.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And last but not least, Andy.
Morning, everybody. I'm Andy Strickland. I'm a partner at a private equity firm called Palatine. We have 3 fund strategies, but the one I work in operates the lower mid-market, investing a £250 million fund, and I head up our tech service investing. And in terms of why I'm here today, well, I think you can probably tell straight off the fact that I'm wearing a shirt and everybody else is in t-shirts that I'm the least technical person on this call. So I will preface now that the other guys on this call will be able to get into very deep and exciting technical discussions. I hope what I'm able to add is, as a member of a number of technology boards, giving it the view of how companies are now using data and analytics to shape how business outcomes are measured from more of a board level, and trying to come in with those sorts of angles.
Thank you so much, Andy. Your expertise is very welcomed here. So we're going to make a start. Cameron, I'm actually going to pivot the first question to you, if you don't mind. So I'd like to ask why you think traditional delivery frameworks are no longer sufficient, and what a shift towards outcome-based success actually looks like in your view.
Yeah, so in short, for context, Premise is an ROI play for our customers, who are primarily online retailers, typically trading in luxury or high-end goods. And they want to see us deliver on our promise of generating ROI. So that would be through increased sales, increased loyalty and engagement with their customers, or a reduction in where is my order queries coming through to their customer service desk. They are not interested in feature releases per se. They're interested in what impact those will have on generating that ROI for their business. So I want to say we've shifted to an outcome driven model, but we've actually always implemented one. And what we do is we embed customer and business outcomes into our delivery goals. Often tech teams will just be told, what to build and kind of talk about the how to deliver that, but they're left out of the conversation around why we're actually building something. So we encourage a culture of distributed product thinking across our team. Some of the best ideas come from the most junior engineers who are stuck in the code and solving problems, at the coalface. And we embed that throughout the scoping process. So from the beginning, all of our new features and functionality will begin with what we call the business AC. So that will outline, why we're doing this for the customer, why we're doing this as a business, and why we believe it's the right thing to do. And I find that aligning the team around that really helps to drive productivity. But equally, there's a kind of a point in the question here. The productivity point is an important one. And I do not treat my teams that I've led over the years as like a manufacturing line. I think that's outdated. And there was a conversation had previously outside of this around, how Google Maps came about. And I think that encapsulated it perfectly. We really want to encourage the team to band around the business's objectives. So I find that continuous improvements, iterative delivery, and validating our outcomes with real world data has been super important, and really kind of aligning everyone around the why. And then, sorry, go back to the productivity point. I went off on a tangent there. Is what we are really doing is knowledge work, and allowing your team space to think, be creative, and be innovative is really important. And like I said already, that's where some of our most powerful features and functionality has been born out of. Yeah.
Fantastic. Ritam, do you agree that the how and the kind of establishing the why and the how is so important in kind of the more modern sort of frameworks that are available today rather than the traditional?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I always sort of feel that when you're building a digital product, there's a why you're building it, there's a what you're building, and there's how do you build it. And I think we've always tried to segregate those three, but they are interlinked. So how you build it is interlinked with the why. And I think, Cameron, your point earlier was, it made a lot of sense, which is actually the people who are involved in the how, understanding the why makes the how more effective. So understanding why we're doing it and constantly linking the work that we're doing to the reason why we're building this product's really, really important. And I think as we accelerate the speed at which we're building digital products, as advent of AI, and we're constantly experimenting and we're using data to drive why we're building things, the people who are focused on how you're building something need to understand why we're building it and what's the outcome we're striving for. So absolutely agree.
And Andy, I know you said to give a high level approach, but the note of that Cameron mentioned a little bit about sort of organically finding ideas, is that something within in your kind of business you find is kind of taking shape rather than sort of mechanical sort of day by day as we used to do in traditional delivery frameworks?
I think it's really interesting. I think that the point that Cameron raised about ROI is really key. So I think in the conversations that we're having at board level on the strategy and thinking about the products that the businesses I'm involved in are generating, I think there is such a need now for demonstrable ROI on product. And I think there's two aspects to the question I'm asking from you here. Is one, I think giving people the time and space to think about things and come up with really interesting ideas is really important. But I think also being able to link that back to something that creates and generates ROI is really important for the client. And I think where I've seen things not go so well historically is when that ROI focus has been lost and development for development's sake has occurred, and not understanding where the proposition sits and what is trying to be solved. So I think understanding all of those pieces and bringing that together and being able to link that to an ROI gives a real focus. Giving people the tools and the time to think about how to do that has to be the most effective way to do that.
Yeah, I totally agree. That kind of leads quite nicely onto my next question. This is actually something where, Ritam, I'm going to throw it back to you, and then I'd love to get Steve's kind of opinion here about specific metrics that have proven, excuse me, I think I've got the cold that everybody's got at the moment. What specific metrics have proven most effective in improving product quality, team productivity, and transparency? I'd be really keen to hear a little bit more about your Pulse product that you mentioned at the beginning, and kind of weave that into the kind of efficacy question.
Yeah, it's front of mind even at the moment. So when we started building Pulse, a big part of our focus was what metrics do we measure? And I still remember one of the first metrics was code quality. It's a terrible metric because it just kind of exemplifies the quantity of something you're putting out without any of the other elements. But being sort of transparent here, we were trying to put metrics out there to realize if they were useful. And then I think for us at the moment, what's been really interesting to see is what metrics are useful. Can we action and learn from? Because at the end of the day, we're trying to use metrics to improve. And one of the big sort of takeaways recently for us has been that maybe it's not just the quantitative metrics, but qualitative metrics, which are subjective. And one of the things we're exploring at the moment is looking at getting some sort of quick survey responses for people talk about developer experience, but how are people feeling? How do you collect data about how people are feeling about the project? How are people feeling about the quality of the work that the team's producing? And so these aren't necessarily metrics that are ones that you just quantify off the back of some kind of static code analysis, but it's actually more emotive. And everyone talks about building software as being quite, I don't know, objective and crude, and computers understand zeros and ones. But actually one of the metrics we're trying to, or set of metrics we're trying to explore is around how people feel. And one of the things when I was thinking about this webinar was I wanted to weave in what's kind of influenced us a little bit, which is a book called Accelerate. And that's sort of analyzed, I don't know, thousands of bits of feedback from CTOs and technology leaders. And half of it talks about quantitative metrics, and half of it talks about qualitative and experience-oriented metrics. And I just feel like everyone, including me, we jump towards the quantitative ones because you think of metrics as being something that you just measure based on data and quantity. But right now, we're also trying to almost conflate how people feel, because we feel that that's a big driver to the outcome and quality of the project. So we're probably moving more towards higher level metrics. And then the other thing we're trying to do is look at how certain metrics influence each other. So does going too quickly improve quality or make it worse? Where are we spending our time? So we have timesheet data. Are we spending time on fixing things? Are we having an impact? So impact metrics. So we're starting to look at metrics in a sort of more subjective way and trying to learn from the metrics that we get on what metrics we should be measuring, rather than just kind of looking at them and jumping to conclusions at the moment.
It's a very sensible approach. And Steve, I know that you've used Pulse. I'd love to hear your perspective on this question.
Correction, I haven't used Pulse.
Oh,
But
You've seen
in
it.
conversations,
you've
I've seen it. I've seen it, and I
You've
tried to
seen
build
Pulse.
one some years prior. So it's one of the reasons why I think Ritan and I have kind of gelled, is because of our mutual love of metrics, right? It's measurements, it's all about measurement, right? So with respect to the question, I'm going to combine the first two. So if we accept that traditional delivery frameworks are no longer sufficient, we have to accept that the metrics are wrong, right? It goes without saying. It's the metrics and the processes that are wrong. So when you start looking at outcome-based, the best examples you can come up, I guarantee you, of good, successful, outcome-based approaches are startups that succeed, right? Every one of them started with an MVP. That MVP was time-boxed. They talked to investors, right? And like Andy, and convinced him and his fellow investors to invest in them because they had a vision and they had an experiment, the MVP, that would show that they were right or that they were wrong. And if they were wrong, some of them would have shifted, they would have pivoted, and they would have done the same. And it's that same process, and it is about agility. It's totally about business agility. Forget software agility. Business agility drives it all. And the metrics of success are entirely down to some numbers that are reported at the end of every quarter. Right now, I hung out with lots of salespeople over the years, so I'm really aware of what presenting those metrics are when you present them to the head of sales and you commit to numbers. Software engineers are less aware of that, but actually, going back to what Cameron was talking about, getting those engineers involved in the process, in the business, getting them to understand the business is how you fundamentally align the development of the software against the business need. And developers are problem solvers. This is what they do every day. So give them a challenge and they will come up with the Google Maps of this world. So part of the problem in coming up with metrics is how to figure out what those metrics should be, because some will be leading indicators to revenue and some will be historical indicators that this is how you did. And that balance is critical. And the hardest thing of all is not taking this to a startup. They're already on the journey. They'd love to use Pulse because it would help them gather the metrics that they want. The hardest are the bigger businesses, because they don't operate in these cycles. They say that they've moved to agile, but have they really? Right? They may have moved to agile in terms of the worst thing you can do with agile is measure velocity, right? Don't count story points, right? Absolutely cardinal sin. But that is historically what many have done. So they look at velocity and they don't look at what the outcome is in terms of the numbers. So you can think of it as Brownian motion. There's a lot of motion going on, but for no actual outcome. And so it's absolutely critical that when we take tools in like Pulse, or when we talk about how to do this better, as we have all been doing, that you engage with the business leaders in bigger businesses, because my word, they do need some help.
That's a really interesting perspective. So it's almost like a convincing exercise as well as trying to kind of implement it.
Could I just jump in on that point? Because
yeah, of course.
I think that's a really important point, Steve, that quite often gets lost. And the way I would look at it is, I think businesses quite often get siloed, and views are taken that people like me in shirts are financial people and don't understand technology, which is probably fair. And when we sit around the board table with a lot of other financial people wearing shirts going, what the techies up to? Why are they doing that? That's not what we said. And I think the issue with all of that is the lack of getting everybody together and breaking down those silos and communicating effectively with people as to what we're trying to achieve. Because actually, people just coming at it from different ways, but it's generally a lack of appreciation of the actual goal that is where things are getting broken down. And you get finance people asking for data that's probably not very relevant, and techie people not understanding why that data is being required. So then just everything gets broken down, and actually getting together, having real clarity on what the end goal is. And as you say, Steve, getting some really good problem solvers around a table, you can then set out what you're looking to achieve, and the outcomes will be far greater. And then the ability to measure it effectively becomes phenomenally powerful.
Yeah.
Very good point indeed. Cameron, what's your take on this? Do you kind of agree with the points raised, or do you have a different take?
Yeah, absolutely. And I've seen a lot of it happening now within my position in the C-suite and with investors on board. And the point that was made there around, why do the finance people want to see these things? I think if we all understand, our junior engineer can tell you what our ARR target is for the end of this next financial year, and can understand why he or she is building this really niche integration into some niche carrier in an obscure region of the world, and understand the value that can deliver to us as a business. And so, yeah, I completely agree.
Oh, fantastic. I feel like this kind of leads quite nicely into the next question I was asking, because we've kind of identified the what, but now I'm kind of thinking about the how, kind of how Cameron started the conversation. How businesses can balance transparency and performance pressure to foster continuous impact. I guess it's kind of identifying the problem, but how do you kind of actually implement that into practice? So Ritim, I'd be quite keen to throw this one to you.
Yeah, it's a tricky one for us at the moment, because we are for example, metrics are inherently trying to provide transparency, but what if they're the wrong leading indicator? What if people feel uncomfortable about the metrics that you're showing? So a classic debate we've had internally is, do you look at metrics at a team level? Do you look at metrics at an individual level? Do you look at both? And so we have shied away from looking at metrics at an individual level, because that gets seen as an individual performance. And we are then effectively, we are assuming that rather than fostering team collaboration, we are kind of creating competitiveness within the team. So far we've been only looking at metrics at a team level, but we've been debating that actually do individual metrics also help. And this themes come up as we're trying to collect more qualitative sort of how are you feeling about this project metrics, because those are individual, and of course we'll aggregate them and there'll be a team score. But we're starting to think, is there a risk that we, rather than trying to encourage the team collectively to work together and improve themselves through the metrics that we collect, are we creating individual sort of a performance mindset? And team performance can be different from an individual performance. So how do you make sure that the objective of collecting data and metrics and measuring things is retained, and it's not misinterpreted as a more competitive, performance-oriented one? So we don't have league tables, we don't have any kind of ratings associated with the metrics, but we are now looking at, there are certain metrics which we think are important to measure at an individual level to give people an opportunity to self-improve. But it's managing that psychological element, which is people shouldn't feel that they're being measured and monitored in the sense of a sort of nanny state, but we're trying to make sure that they feel that the sentiment is correct. So we're working quite hard to explain the rationale behind each metric. We're trying to explain why we measure it and why it might be important, and we're trying to explain that we are still ourselves learning and we might be measuring the wrong metric, so people shouldn't read too much into what we're measuring. But yeah, it's really hard to kind of balance that sort of, we're doing this for the right reasons to improve things rather than make it a performance management tool, so to speak.
It's a really interesting perspective, because I guess it's sort of, that balance is actually a lot harder than you probably think it is, because it's kind of balancing sort of autonomy but also working collaboratively. And Andy, at a high level, do you kind of find the same thing in your kind of line of work? How do you guys try and solve that sort of balance and issues that may be faced?
I think one of the things I was thinking as that was being discussed was, I think it's quite easy, especially for financial people, to jump into performance measures and think about performance solely as output and efficiency and those sorts of things. I think there's a couple of points here. I think having more and more accurate data points has to be helpful, as long as it's used effectively. And I think there's a risk with having too much data or having the accessibility of data points we will now start to get over the next few years is that it's just used as something to completely harangue people with. And I think what can be used here is not just looking at productivity and performance data, but I think wellness and happiness and using data points around that and how people are feeling about the team and the organization, and coupling performance with wellness and mindfulness and using data to do all of those things is really important in developing effective teams. And for me, that's where this needs to go, because I think otherwise there is a risk that everything becomes so automated that individuals just feel like robots. And what we need is people to be happy, to be creative, to enjoy where they're working, and that will create the best outcomes. So for me, it's really important to think about how to balance those things and what the right measures are, what the frequency of those measures are, and providing leadership in that way.
Yeah, I think just to kind of add to that, the metric that I think covers the, both the soft and the like the measurable data and the numbers for me personally is how invested the team are in what they're building. So we'll have fortnightly retros, and that's what we're looking to basically ascertain from feedback from the team. And you can very quickly see if the team is not invested, and that very quickly will lead to a fall in product to the team.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking before you said that, I was thinking to myself, I'd love to get the metrics on the team that did Google Maps, right? If that was done part-time, what did the metrics look like for the Google Maps versus the other stuff they were doing? Because as you said, they clearly were invested in Google Maps. Now, it doesn't mean that that's bad, because continuous impact, if you think about what that is, it doesn't just include output, it includes outcome. So on an outcome level, the Google Maps team did brilliantly, but it might be on an output level on their other job, they didn't do as well. But the overall impact for the team, and it is the team, was probably really good. And so I think, the performance metrics in some way, shape or form, largely self-policed by developers, right? So, and I think that is kind of where they belong. What you hope is that they improve, whatever improvement is, and that can include things like well-being. When you start a project and you start story pointing that project, you're story pointing it with the team. It's the story points of the team, not individuals. It's how will the team produce an outcome, not what an individual contribution is. They know their contributions. The tighter bound that team is, the more self-supportive they'll become. So all the wellness, the mindfulness stuff, absolutely spot on. The longer you can keep a team together, the more reliable their estimates and story pointing become. And from a management perspective, that means you've got predictability, which you don't really have a lot when it's a new team. It's a guess when it's a new team. And then what you're measuring is, how accurate are they in guessing how long it's going to take? And, and that's how the game works. So the story points aren't about measuring one team against another. It's about measuring the predictability of the teams to be able to deliver an outcome. And that is entirely based upon the team dynamics and their common history.
I think it's interesting that this question has also raised that sort of age-old sort of problem that we've always had, which is the sort of the great balance between technology and the human touch, I guess, having that balance correct. So I guess this balance is more, it's not just metric specific, but it's also kind of balancing the greatness between the human touch, but also, and the human aspect of all of this, and obviously kind of the automation side. And if you go too far one way, it doesn't kind of foster that continuous impact that businesses are looking for. So it's a really interesting perspective that I think that question raised, and I'm not sure if I kind of predicted that it would go that way, but I'm really pleased it did, because I think it kind of fosters a lot of questions. And I'm going to stay with you, Steve, actually, because the next question I wanted to ask was about how you could, some of the best practices for aligning engineering metrics to broader business goals, and that's definitely your area of expertise.
Oh, did I volunteer for that one?
You did.
I must have done. It's an interesting one, because I've had a history of being an enterprise architect, and we're supposed to know what these business goals are, right? We operate at that boundary. And, when agile practices came in, that was quite revolutionary, because a lot of architecture stuff was almost unwaterful, really. But in terms of specific things that I've used that I did find work really well was value stream mapping. It's a very simple one, but incredibly powerful. So when you have a system or process that you're looking at and you want to automate it, you really need to know what it is you're trying to do in terms of what that process looks like. So using value stream mapping techniques, and there's a lot written on this. The best ones that I've seen are from ThoughtWorks. What you got out of that was a clear understanding of low-hanging fruit outcomes against longer investment outcomes. And that then enabled us to set up the agile teams that could work with the subject matter experts directly, so they're part of the team. So it's this one team ethos for each of them. And ensure that there was this alignment all the way to the top in terms of the business goals, that whatever that system was required to. In this case, it was a bank, and it was about doing some pretty important reports, and if they didn't get them right, they'd get shut down. So it was pretty critical to be able to get this right. And I've used the same technique in several companies to understand where there are inefficiencies in processes, where those processes are completely about delivering business value, and then try to sort of set up projects that would actually deliver outcomes in each of those areas. So that's the best one that I've seen so far. There's a couple of others that are worth looking at. So there was a technique called House of Quality that's used in Six Sigma. It's a bit more difficult to wield. It's not as agile friendly. But what it had was fantastic alignment techniques, from visionary statements all the way down to pieces of software that you're going to write. So down to the requirements. But I just found I quite enjoyed using it, but it's something that you use in your bedroom at night, to be honest, because it's just too difficult to use with lots of people in an agile way. So for me, it would be value stream mapping.
Oh, fantastic. This is quite a nice segue as well, Andy. I'm gonna put you back in the spotlight, I'm afraid. So, because obviously I would say value creation is the buzzword of the private equity market, and how to create best value practices. How would you say private equity firms are shifting from cost cutting to operational improvements and measurable performance in their value creation strategies?
Sure. So first, to try to get in a defense for the private equity industry, is that I hope the slashing costs and getting rid of people is something more of the 80s and 90s, more than recent times. So I will do that, but I'll get my retribution in first on that one. But I take the point, and I will run with it. So I think to answer the question less flippantly, I think you're right. If you look at the industry 10, 15 years ago, it was a less commoditized product from a private equity perspective. There was less competition. There was a greater ability to invest well in a business with less educated management teams, and probably able to garner a better deal at a lower multiple. And that created the ability to put a relatively high amount of debt, relatively amount of equity going into the business, and you could financially engineer your way to a successful outcome without having to focus too much on exactly where that growth came from. Investors were just comfortable that you were getting a good return for them. As the market has shifted and there's far many more players in the market, the ability to explain to management teams what value you can add to a company is really important. And investors are very focused on understanding where growth came from and what were the things that the investor helped the management team in bringing out towards the end of the investment. So that will look to be mapped. And even in the last 18 months, that requirement for data points has increased it tenfold. to kind of go off at a slight tangent. So if you look at businesses that acquire other businesses, the ability to just create scale, put it all together, that's gone. You have to be able to show exactly how the integration happens. You have to use data points to do it. You have to be able to show the split of different types of revenue. You have to be able to show cross-sell. You have to be able to show organic growth. So the ability to have data points to do that is really vital. I think, therefore, given that requirement will become more and more, there are a couple of challenges here. One, if you can create more financial data points to financial people, they will ask for more financial data points, and there's a risk that you get really lost with that. So I think one of the themes coming out of this discussion across a variety of areas is clarity on what is being requested and why, and people being bought into that is really important in whatever area you're going to. To be able to effectively map that value enhancement and where it has been delivered, you're going to have to invest in systems, which is very easy to say. There's lots out there. And I think the point Steve made earlier of the difference between a younger business and a more mature business is really marked here, because trying to do that in an established business that already has systems is really tricky. You're retrofitting something in many cases. But the most important thing about it is not investing in the technology that you use to do that. It's how you implement it, how you put it across your team, how people are trained to use it, and how it's used effectively. Because if it's not, it won't get used properly. It won't get the data points you need. So for me, I think the most important element of how you can show value enhancement is firstly understanding the strategy and everybody being bought in and clear on how you do that, but then investing in the technologies that allow you to measure those outcomes so people can see that they are tracking against those strategic goals, and implementing those effectively and getting everybody bought into that is absolutely key in doing that.
I think you raised a really good point, Andy, there, actually, because Cameron, I'm going to throw to you. I don't want to put you on the spot, but I'm quite keen to understand how Primis kind of uses technology within their business to kind of, I guess, enhance value. You know, we're talking about private equity here, but from your business's perspective, it'd be great to hear how you implement it and any sort of challenges you've faced or similar.
Yeah, so I'm going to kind of pivot it a little bit. And we are, in essence, a real-time data source for leadership within our customers' teams. I think there can be a mismatch. Like sometimes too much data can be overwhelming, and it can just lead to decision paralysis rather than actually contributing positively. So that's something that we've looked to help streamline for our customers. So we deliver a monthly report summarizing things. We are implementing AI to provide actionable insights from all of our different data streams. And what we've learned as a business from that is we leverage the same data around shipping times, for SLA management and other items to really support our customers. And yeah, but the important part is, like, we can't stare at the number and wait and watch it move. It's taking a bird's eye view on it and turning it into something that can actually be implemented and move your business forward, whether that's us internally at Primis or for our customers.
You mentioned there, Cameron, that sort of the risk of the over-reliance on data. I like that data paralysis point. I think it's a really interesting way of putting it. Steve, I'm quite keen to throw it back to you a little bit about what you think what the main risks from your perspective is on the over-reliance on data, and what can actually happen if businesses rely too heavily on data metrics.
So let's imagine gathering all these metrics that we might want to gather. But now let's move the world on, and let's have it one where we've transformed our industry and almost all code is AI generated. So start from that premise. So there's an over-reliance just in that statement that the AI language models that we use aren't going to have a bad day, right? When they have a bad day, it's catastrophic. So the processes, and therefore the metrics that we need to put in place, start to change quite measurably. So the number of iterations you can do to get some feature out, right, or the time for that iteration shrinks massively because the code just shrinks. Instead of it taking 2 weeks, it takes a day. What increases on the other side, and if you don't allow for this in the metrics, you'll miss it, is the review that you need to put in place now, because now you need to review what's generated, right? Your job as a software developer has been, actually, it's been taken up to another level. You're now programming with a language model by writing very clear, hopefully unambiguous requirements and asking it to write code against them. And if you just do that and then have it come back at you, and it all, let's say it all runs. I've done this myself. So I'm speaking from having done this myself. All runs. But, you know, it's highly inefficient. You know, you need to ingest a file that's 16 gigabytes and try to suck it all into memory in one go. It'll blow up if you try and do that at some point. So you'll lack the nuances of scalability. There may be errors in the code. So we need metrics to change along with the processes that need to change. Yeah, and I'm pretty sure software production is going to change in this way. There's too many language models out there. I mean, I heard that there's a company, there's a guy that I know that works for a very large SI. I won't mention their name. He's actually created a string of these language models. So 6 of them, the 6 biggest. And he puts the requirements in the top and he gets the code out the bottom and they self-reinforce each other, and he takes the best one, uses an eigenvector, and then goes back in and educates all the language models. And you know, he's convinced now that our industry is going to change dramatically. The only thing that we have on our side is output is not outcome. And so the metrics that we put down today will be the metrics that we will need. We'll change them over time. That will steer this new ship that's driven by a lot of AI in our heartland of software development. And what will be key is the experience you bring on board that will wield those AI language models, asking those questions. The skills will change from university coming into places. And the key will be how we measure that process ourselves, and the metrics we put in place to understand we've got the right balance of the skills required to develop that software.
I love your point about output not being outcome. I feel like there's a lot of great sentiments being mentioned in this webinar today, and I think they're really, really self-explanatory to the best way. They really encapsulate quite a wider problem in the industry. I'd like to conclude the discussion throwing it back to you, Ritim, about how the ways in which real-time data is transforming leadership decision-making. So obviously kind of touching upon a couple of the points that Steve's made, but I'd love to hear your thoughts about kind of the transformative aspect of all of this, rather than kind of the kind of problems and everything else.
No, it's fascinating. I think one of the things I've been taking away through this conversation, and it's sort of reinforced our thinking around, with quantitative data and with leadership, right? You're trying to you jump towards velocity. So you jump towards, I want to show that things are moving fast and that we're doing a lot. You just naturally jump towards showing quantity. It's just your first intuitive reaction. And I think what we're all saying is it's really the outcome that matters. It's not the volume. And I think with AI, we'll just pump out more volume. The question is, what's the outcome? And I think it's the issue we've had in the past, if we look at it, is most software, most code that's written is thrown away. Most of what we produce as humans in terms of software product is thrown away. You know, I can't remember the exact stats, but it's like 80 to 90% of code that's written is thrown away. It's never used. You know, maybe 5% of features in most products are used by 90% of people. So the issue is not our inability to produce volume. And just naturally with data, we think that's a measure of volume. And I think, how do we use data to improve what we do in terms of outcomes, and actually measure outcomes rather than output? So there's a lot of studies and theories around what are the metrics that measure outcomes? And they usually join together different data sets to make those decisions. But one of the sort of examples that I'll give from a leadership decision-making perspective is I really care about how can we improve. I'm happy as long as we're improving. And one of the metrics we've been measuring is a sort of self-reported metric, which is the root cause analysis. So if we ship something and there's a defect, you know, the engineer themselves have to volunteer from a drop-down why they think that defect occurred. Same thing with the quality assurance engineer. They have to volunteer and be honest about why they think this slipped through the cracks. And what we are using that data for is to learn and improve ourselves. So I think it's you need to realize why you want the data, because until you really dig deep and sort of soul search almost around why you want that data, you're likely to measure the wrong thing, and the management decisions actually could go in the wrong direction. So I think it's the why do you want this data, and the alignment. I think what we've all been saying on this webinar is that the alignment's super important, because actually you can do a small amount of work that can have a huge amount of impact. And if we're measuring the impact and we're aligning to the impact, it's not about velocity. It's really about making sure we're having metrics that are measuring impact, which is really complicated. It's not easy. It's not a hard and fast rule. They're not dry metrics. They're things that you really have to think about. But if you can align to the why you're doing something, if you can align to the outcomes and somehow join those metrics together to give you something that reasonably accurately gives you if you're directionally heading in the right direction, it really helps. And that's why I was giving the example of one of our big whys is we measure things because we want to get better. So what metrics are actually going to help us improve? And an example was we came up with this idea of measuring root cause analysis. Why are certain mistakes happening, and using them to self-improve? So yeah, I think looking at the why and looking at what outcomes and aligning those is important. And if you can do that, then I do think it's a very useful aid for management decision making.
Could I just add one point on that? Because I think with increased levels of data, there is a tendency to really just focus and pinpoint on the negative ones or the underperforming ones. I think it's really important that people don't spend 95% of the time on the one thing that's not working very well. I think people spend 95% of the time looking at the things that are working really, really well. And if you continue to get those things to work better, the more negative things will just disappear. And I do think I've seen it recently with more data that people can just get fixated with the bit that isn't going quite well. Now, clearly, if there's a big problem, you've got to look at that. But I think with so much data, it is very easy to get micro-focused on something. And I think people just need to make sure that they get their head up and think about the bigger picture as part of it.
You know, it'd be nice to, at the end of every retrospective, for instance, in a sprint, it would be nice to get the developers, well, the team, not just the developers, the entire team, to write down one thing that they were really pleased about for that sprint and why. And that would capture a very interesting sentiment. And given you're capturing the root cause stuff, that would be the balance on the other side.
100% agree. I think just adding to that, Steve, I think that's our big realization at the moment is, you know, in my sort of simple terms, happy teams do good work. How do we create a positive feeling? And I think about it more and more as, you know, people are working in hybrid teams, remote teams. Sometimes you don't, you know, 80% of communication is body language. So if you're not in the same physical environment, you not realize you're not happy. So actually our big realization and almost pivot and focus is now about how do we make sure that people feel engaged, they feel committed, they're happy, they're enjoying it. And it'll be really interesting as we start to explore that data set. But you're absolutely right. You need to create that positive like what went well. We all look at what went badly, but what went well, because you do more of that. And also I think the idea of it's a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you feel confident and you feel positive about your work, that confidence in itself allows you to do better work. So constantly taking a negative view wouldn't help. And I think it's a really good point. Data can just pick out all the negatives sometimes.
you know, one example of, you know, if I look back on the project that I've been involved in, and I was to pick a moment that actually makes me smile, I was very happy about. I'd been looking at a problem for so long that I only saw it one way. And then I was working with Peter, who you know, and Peter said, well, why can't it be like this? And it was a wonderful aha moment where I thought, oh my God, he's right. And there was a huge amount of joy in understanding why that was such a simple solution, and that I'd overcomplicated it, and I had learnt along the way.
It's
That's
a very nice
metric.
It is an improvement metric. It's a great way to summarize the discussion. And I think that what this has raised is that the balance between, as I mentioned, that human touch and human behavior, along with digitalization and technology, is what is absolutely paramount for kind of these sort of successful outcomes. I'm looking forward to seeing what the future holds, I suppose. I'm going to give a couple of minutes just so anybody can input a question if they have anything. But otherwise, I think the lasting message I'd like to do is just go to each panelist and say, give just a very brief summary of what you think the next, I don't know, let's say 5 years, what you see the direction going in for the next 5 years on these sort of measurable outcomes in digital project delivery. What are your predictions? It would be interesting if we did like a 5-year webinar and we bring you all back and see how many people were correct. Do you want to start, Ritam? What do you foresee?
Yeah, I think I'm probably going to pick what a lot of people are thinking, which is, you know, AI is going to absolutely transform everything. And it's going to Steve's point earlier, it's going to transform how quickly we build things. So velocity will become even less of a problem. It'll be about making sure you build the right thing and you're building it for a purpose and it achieves an outcome. And, you know, there are many kind of facets of AI, but one of the things that is clearly getting a lot of attention and traction and having an impact on knowledge work is the large language models. And sort of the 5-year prediction that if I had to make one around this theme and data is it'll completely change the way we look and query data. So when even within Pulse at the moment, we're experimenting with, can we get a large language model to talk to our data to help us get insights? So it's a more conversational way in which we engage with the data rather than looking at a visualization or just querying it or doing some kind of search. And so I think my sort of prediction, so to speak, over the next 5 years is the ability to talk in natural language to data is going to allow us to be more creative in the way we talk to that data and more creative in how we use that data. I think that's going to be a big change in terms of our mindset around how we speak to the data.
We've muted.
Oh, I'm muted. Sorry, I should be better at this by now. Steve, what's your prediction?
Well, I think over the next 2 to 3 years, you're going to see a marked increase in digital entrepreneurship, simply because if the velocity is no longer a problem and finding language models to do most of the work, you're going to need fewer people with greater design skills. So it's going to shift to being able to control those large language models by having unambiguous descriptions of what it is you want to do. That's now to 3 years. 3 to 5 years, they're going to get much better at the nuance in the large language models. And actually, you won't need the unambiguous requirements to be input into those systems anymore. It will be much more conversational, and it will incorporate more design aspects, not just software design, but design aspects in terms of what's a good design from a UX perspective and otherwise. I'm glad that in September I get my old age pension. I'm glad, to be honest, that I don't have to navigate that, and I can sit on the sidelines and spectate, to be honest, and dip in and out as I so desire, because it's a world that I could not have imagined when I sat my O-level in 1974.
Love that perspective. Thanks, Steve. And Cameron, what about you? What are you predicting from your perspective?
Yeah, I think Ritam said it really well. My point was going to be around AI and being able to interact with data and turn that into actionable insights from your data. Not everyone has studied statistics to a master's degree level at university and understands the nuances of looking at data, the difference between correlation and causation, just as a starting point. And I think that AI will help bridge that. And then going over one of the other points is I'm excited to see what the next the entrepreneurship opportunities that come out of this. I think we'll see a lot of younger people building really exciting products, really exciting businesses. And I think that it's going to be a move back away from us that understand tech. And I say that I'm flattering myself when I say that, and moving back towards basically the creatives being able to build the things that they need with less of the likes of us. And the people who can do that well and build products that people and society need now will have even more tools available to them. And I'm really excited to see what that leads to.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Thanks, Cameron. And finally, Andy.
I think I'm excited and nervous in probably equal measure as to what the next 5 years holds. If we came back in 5 years, I might not have a job. It might all be done through AI. So that's from a personal perspective creates a sense of nervousness. But I think if I think about the businesses that we work with and how the speed of change, as everybody talks about, is going to be something that hasn't been seen since the Industrial Revolution. And harnessing that effectively is going to see an awful lot of false starts and some decisions made to try to keep up with other things that probably aren't right. And there are going to be some businesses that win really well here and some that really struggle. And I think trying to harness that adoption of change effectively is going to be an incredible challenge for everybody, because we are going to be learning as we go in with a lot of this, with things that we haven't seen before at a pace we haven't seen before. So I'm really excited and optimistic that it's going to create a huge amount of opportunity. I'm also nervous that along the way there's going to be, unfortunately, some collateral damage in what happens. But let's look at the positivity. I think it creates an awful lot of opportunity. It is going to change the way we do things. It is going to create a lot of efficiency, and it is going to be really exciting.
Thank you very much. Well, and thank you again. We have no further questions and we're almost bang on time, so that's amazing. Thank you so much to all of our lovely panelists. It was a really interesting discussion. And to you all watching, please do get in touch if you have any additional questions or any follow-ups. We'd be more than happy to help. But thank you so much for all of your time, and have a great afternoon. Thanks, everyone.